Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Atlas Project. Tonight, we're going to be discussing Part 3, Chapter 2 of Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. The chapter is called Anti-Greed. If you are just joining us for the first time, welcome. This is a weekly chapter-by-chapter reading group about Ayn Rand's magnum opus, Atlas Shrugged. Every week, we discuss the chapter of the book online. If you'd like to join in our discussions, apart from watching this broadcast, you can go to our Facebook group. There's a link to that in the comment section of the post that you're viewing this on the Atlas Shrugged Facebook page. I've also included a few other links about the project. One is to past recordings if you want to catch up. And another of special interest is a link to the Atlas Shrugged essay contest information. You can win up to $10,000 by submitting and winning the contest that's sponsored by the Ayn Rand Institute. Having this project was in part inspired by the idea of getting more people to write for the Atlas contest. So we'd be happy to see that we get some people interested in that. But more than anything, we're interested in talking about this book. And apart from that, I did have one other announcement I'd like to get started with tonight, and that's just that we had a special broadcast this past weekend. The last chapter that we discussed, Chapter 2, was a especially deep chapter, and so we had a second episode where we discussed more of the philosophical significance of the chapter. We did that on Sunday, and for some reason we had some technical difficulties that we've previously never had before. Some people were able to see us live, and some people just weren't, and we're still not really sure about why that happened. The same people who couldn't see us live also couldn't see the Facebook Live recording. However, if that happened to be one of you, you should know there are many other recordings that you now should be able to see. There's a version of this, of the Sunday recording on YouTube. There's a version on iTunes, the various other podcast venues that we use. And there's also the edited version of the episode that is uploaded to the Facebook group about the Atlas Project. We always upload the edited versions there later that night. So if you're still looking to see what you missed, there's lots of ways to find it, especially if you go and join the Atlas Project Facebook group.
And the editing isn't really abridging it. It's just, getting rid of the dead silence at the beginning as we're setting up and so forth.
And fumbling about various technical difficulties, which hopefully we will not have to do tonight, and I will not have to stay up as late as usual. So with that, let me turn you all over to Greg Salmieri, who's in New York with our group, and Greg's going to get us started with a summary of the chapter.
Yeah, thanks. So this is Dagny's first chapter back in the world, right? The previous chapter ended with Galt taking her out of the valley. And the chapter has three sequences. The first sequence is Dr. Stadler at Project X. We finally learn what Project X is, and Dr. Stadler learns it. It's some kind of destructive sound ray, and we get his experience at the unveiling of it, the ceremony unveiling of it. We'll talk about that shortly. Then we cut to sequence 2, which is Dagny's return to the world. We get her observations about people in the train and plane on her way home. Among them, she's seeing people react to this broadcast of the Project X unveiling. We get her first call to Hank Rearden. She comes to work and learns of the railroad unification plan and encounters Cuffy Miggs, who's a new character in charge of that plan. He's the head of unification, or the unificator, as she calls him. We get Jim Taggart pressuring Dagny to appear on the radio to reassure the public that she hasn't quit, that Directive 10-289 is a patriotic and good-spirited program that will save the country and so forth. She refuses, at which point Lillian Rearden appears, attempting to extort her into appearing on the radio via telling Dagny how Rearden was pressured into giving up his medal through the revelation of their affair, and Dagny says that she will appear on the radio. And then sequence 3 begins with her radio broadcast, where Dagny tells the world about the affair proudly, and talks a bit about the meaning of sex and the meaning of the affair to her, and with a kind of defiance at conventional morality. There's a fair amount one could say about the radio broadcast itself, but we're not going to talk much about it tonight because there's so much else in this chapter to say, and because we've had other occasions to talk about the view of sex that Dagny and some of the other characters share. And then she takes a cab ride back to her apartment where she finds Rearden waiting, and we have a discussion between Dagny and Rearden that's significant and that we will spend some time on. So we're going to just begin by talking about the episode with Project X and Stadler. Then we're going to talk about the unification plan and Cuffy Meggs, and we will then go on to talk about Dagny's observations of people across the chapter, both of the people she meets as she's on her way back to Taggart Transcontinental, and her developing understanding of Jim and the looters, and then we'll talk about her the scene with Rearden. And one reason to focus on Dagny's observations and views of people is recall that the reason that she thinks she can't fail in her quest to come back and save the world of Taggart Transcontinental is that she thinks that people still value their lives, and that's the remnant of rationality within them. And Hugh Axton has told her, do they? Take that back with you as the last premise to check. So we should expect a big issue over the course of the next few chapters, now that we have Dagny back in the outer world, is her thinking about, well, what is it that drives the people out here, and particularly the worst of the people out here, people like her brother? Is it really a desire to live? Is it something else? And so that's why I think it's worth taking special, effort to think about Dagny's observations of people. But let's start with this Project X scene, and notice that it begins with Stadler himself wondering why he's come. Right? We learn shortly that he was summoned there by Ferris, right, with orders that are proper in tone for military communications, not scientific correspondence, and that he resents being there. He thinks to himself he could have not come, but he has come. Ben, I think I'm now getting the signal that my connection is too slow for quality. We're going out today via an LTE hotspot on the premise that it might be more reliable than the way we've gone out in the past. I'm a bit skeptical of that, although we did use it as a backup in the past. Now we're back to perfect streaming, so I'm going to keep an eye on the quality gauge here. We can go to the way we've normally broadcast if this becomes an issue, but we thought this, though slower than the way we normally use, might be more consistent in quality. I haven't seen any major problems
with the broadcast yet.
Okay, so Stadler does go to to this demonstration of Project X, and I think it's pretty clear that he's afraid to refuse to go and afraid to admit that to himself. We asked why Stadler was there as one of our questions on the forum, and I mean, one element of that is why does he come, and another element of it is why does Ferris want him there? And we got a lot more traction, I think, because the way we wrote the question featured this aspect of it on Ferris's motivation. All right, so Ben was saying that, I'll just read a few passages that he had quoted Tarsha and Pooja, and also Greg P. had also pointed out that Stadler is providing sanction. He grants this by his supportive speech combined with a controlled, unquestioning press. Good. So for the locals, thoughts on either Stadler's reasons for coming or Ferris's interest in having him there that go beyond, if any, that they need a sanction from him, which I think is the essential point.
The simple answer is he likes badges.
He likes badges?
Yeah.
What kind of badges are involved?
I invented this, Mr. Project X.
Except he doesn't want to take responsibility for Project X, right? I mean, he does.
Before the moment.
What?
Before the moment. At the moment, he does.
So you're saying in the moment when he's up on stage, he wants the credit for it?
Absolutely. I think that's unequivocal.
Do we have agreement or disagreement in the room on that point? That he wants to take the credit for the thing?
It seems as if there's at least a bit of a conflict about him taking credit for it or not, but it seems like he doesn't really have other options.
Yeah, I mean, so it's he does, right, accept the credit or responsibility for it. So that's unequivocal that he does that. The question is why, and one possible reason is he's a guy who likes to get credit for things, and I guess that's what you're suggesting, Earl. The way I understood the reason is he's threatened by Ferris that if he doesn't accept the credit for it and doesn't praise it to the people, then they'll turn on him and they'll throw him out, and he'll be stuck out in the world with he won't be able, the state, he'll be fired from the State Science Institute. People will be told he's a traitor. There'll be nobody to stand up for him. Some man like Hugh Axton might have in the old days, but there aren't people like that to be found. So I don't think it's that people might interpret differently, but I don't think it's that he enjoys the plaudits for this. Ben, yeah, go ahead, Will. I'm trying to see what, here we go, Ben's returned to us.
Yeah, I think you're right. What you're saying, what I said is you get a lot with a smile, and you said you get a lot with a smile, and more with a smile and a gun.
And so Ferris has got the gun, in addition to
as Oscar Wilde might have said, the only thing worse for him than taking the responsibility for it would be not taking the responsibility for it.
Right. So this is a responsibility that he would rather this invention didn't exist. If it did exist and someone else could take the blame for it, so to speak, there's a way in which he would rather that. But he is, there we go, there's Ben. But with things as they are and with the people in charge who are in charge, he feels obligated, or he feels like he has no option but to take this route, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important to make the point, too, it was a resounding, I suppose pun intended, success, but had it been a failure, he would have denied that it was his. So that establishes that he'll go with whatever is the prevailing wind.
I'm not convinced of that. I think he would have done whatever Ferris demanded at this point. But let's leave that as a question for people to debate how things might have happened if the project didn't come off. Ben, are you back with us?
Yeah, and I didn't catch all of that conversation you were just having, but I think I caught enough of it to be able to use it as a segue to the next point that I wanted to discuss, which was why it is that Ferris is seeking a sanction from Stadler. And so is it simply the fact that Ferris needs Stadler's support to give, in effect, the government legitimacy? And I think that that's definitely part of it. And I'm sure it's also correct that, we see in several cases where Stadler gets little minor jolts of pleasure for recognition from various people in the stands, but the overriding emotional sense that we're getting from him is one of anxiety. And we get a lot of discussion of how he feels like he's caught up in a machine. There's 2 or 3 separate references to this, and it's a machine that at the same time seems to have no center or leader or direction, of which none was the driver and all were the pawns. And I think that's a very interesting way of describing his situation. And it's one that it has to make you think twice about this idea that the government has these very conscious intentions about what they're trying to get out of this event, especially when you consider the fact that the Stadler reflects on the fact that the main target of the mushroom looking bunker, the Project X machine, is the crowd. And the crowd consists of the intellectual leaders of the country. He's noticed this from the very beginning. So is it just because the intellectual leaders want to put something over on the public that's listening on the radio? I mean, that maybe is part of it. But the crowd in the stands is at various points described as being in a state of panic once they see what this weapon has wrought, and they're looking for somebody to give them some kind of words. Why are they in a state of panic? Stadler thinks they realize that the machine is pointed at them too, and they know it, but they want someone to say something that will relieve them of the burden of this knowledge. And Stadler himself is at various points described as being in a state of panic and doesn't want to recognize the reason for it. And various times we're told he doesn't want to recognize the reason why he came. These are really important pieces of data, psychological data about Stadler's state and his reasons for being there. And I actually don't think that we get a full answer to the question of why he's there and what they're seeking from him and what he's seeking from them, really until the end of the chapter. And it's not a direct answer, but it's one that you have to sort of infer from the actions of other characters and some of the reflections that they make on their situation. But it's notable after all of this that, you know, not only is Stadler not somebody who's glowing with accomplishments from having, you know, gotten some kind of medals, but at the end of the chapter, he's portrayed as dying. I mean, it's the death of Robert Stadler. He engages in some kind of act of self-destruction when he gives this speech and when he asks for the press credentials of the young journalist who, incidentally, he sees his eyes have a hint of hazel. I'm curious if people there have thoughts as to what might be significant about that.
But they're hazel and as such have a hint of green, right? I think it's the hint of green
Yeah.
Any thoughts on why it's significant that the guy, to his response, that the guy has a hint of green in his eyes?
John Galt's eyes are green.
Yeah, John Galt. John Galt's eyes are green, says the table.
And what is he doing here to this guy who reminds him of John Galt? I mean, he's destroying him. And just like the kid goat has been destroyed by this ray. And Stadler knows that he was the one who was responsible for this in some way. So this is all something we're going to have to come back to, I think, at the end of the chapter when we get more explicit sort of reflection on some of the psychological issues that I think are going on here. Greg?
Very well, then let's move on to the railroad unification plan. Although let me just underscore, I think that's a really significant point and not obvious that the stands with all the intellectual leaders, and they're a different stand from the stand with the government leaders, right, are in the path of this ray. And so they're a target of it. So everybody is obviously under threat by this ray in that it's a weapon of mass destruction that now the government has. But we can add to it, Ben, what you're saying in the very immediate fact. Right now, these intellectuals are sitting there right in the path of the ray, and that's a really good point. Okay, so let's move to Dagny at work and the railroad unification plan, and then we'll kind of zoom out or spiral back a bit to talk about her observations of people, which includes the observations of the people listening to this speech on the radio. So very quickly, the plan is just that all the railroads in the country pool their resources. They're pooling their track such that any railroad could use any other railroad's track without charge. And then all the profits made, or all the proceeds, I guess, made, not profits, all the revenues from running trains are put into a pool, which is then distributed to the railroads, not on the old-fashioned basis of how many trains they run or how much tonnage they haul, but on the basis of how much track they have to maintain. That is, on the basis of their need, their chief need being the preservation of their track, as Jim puts it. The result of which is that Taggart Transcontinental is paid for a lot of useless track that hardly anything is riding on, including the track, most of their track west of the Mississippi. but west of the Rocky Mountains, and all of their routes west of the Rocky Mountains, including the route of the comet, is now going on the lines of the Kansas of the Atlantic Southern, which is not getting paid not getting paid for any of that. So why does Dagny regard this plan as especially irrational? Irrational even in a way different from the other actions of the looters, which she regards as irrational. There's something special about this in her mind, anyway. Any thoughts on this?
It's going to run out shorter, last less time than any of the others.
Yeah, it's not sustainable even in the very short term, right? And the way she puts it is, Jim had always managed to switch the weight of his failures switch the weight of his failures upon the strongest plants around him, and survive by destroying them to pay for his errors. And then she gives some examples: Dan Conway, the industrialist of Colorado. But, quote again, this did not even have the rationality of a looter, this pouncing upon a drained carcass of a weaker, half-bankrupt competitor for a moment's delay, right? The Atlantic Southern is not a healthy, robust railroad that can afford to be sapped by Taggart Transcontinental. And yet that's what's happening. And she keeps asking them, has anybody calculated how long it'll be before they go out of business doing this? And no one has. But that's what's striking about this. It's kind of blatantly irrational. It's not, we'll take a little bit more from the rich who can afford it, it's seizing something that's right before you with no thought to what's going to happen in a couple of weeks or a couple of months when that track then can't be maintained. And we have connected with this a new character who's the director of unification, and that's Cuffy Meggs, who I really enjoyed the description of him. He's got the, the revolting handsomeness of a barroom corner, and a few other nice descriptions of him. And we asked people on the forums in what way he's like and unlike the other looter characters we've met. And Ben, do you want to, give some reflections on that?
Yeah, so Pooja in particular mentioned that he's a concrete bound, just live in the range of the moment kind of guy, using no rational long-term thinking to guide him. Dagny asks, what is your economic plan for the day after tomorrow? And he says, you're impractical. And eventually, he also says, in the long run, we're all dead, which is a point that Will points out is a line attributable to the economist Keynes. So that's, I guess, something that is...
We should say if we're going to mention that it's a line of Keynes, the other thing that Will pointed out, which is that, well, Will, you might want to say it yourself.
I was saying that is commonly attributed to Keynes, but actually it's being taken severely out of context, because in the original passage, he is saying that the long run is not useful as a predictor. It's not very helpful to say that after the storm is over, the waves will be smooth again in the long run.
So there's if we're going to mention that it's a line of Keynes's, we should mention there's a concern about whether attributing him this Cuffy Meggs-like thought is fair to him.
Fair point. What I was going to say was that I think that the point that Pooja was making was this short-range mentality, Keynesian or otherwise, was something that made him similar to a lot of the other looters that we've encountered so far in the story. But she then goes on to point out that there's an interesting difference. Unlike the other looters, with a few possible exceptions, he seems to have no conscious concern for the public welfare or the public interest, or he's not using it as an excuse. He's not invoking it. At one point, James, who's in the same scene with Dagny, does try to invoke it, and Miggs sees what James is doing with bored contempt. And David also makes a similar point, that his predecessors made a point of having at ready the instance of the public welfare being served by the official actions to be taken, but Miggs is dispensing with that as superfluous. So there's the kind of cynicism attached to Cuffy that we didn't see with the. I mean, the best person to compare him to is probably Clem Weatherby, if you remember. He was the first major agent of the government that was sent in to monitor Taggart Transcontinental and kind of give indirect orders, though they weren't usually in that form. They were, and he even made the pretense of saying, "I'm here to help," but because Taggart Transcontinental is such an important part of the public interest. But Cuffy's having no bones with that kind of pretense, it seems.
Yeah, or feels no need for it. I mean, Gene points out he dictates orders directly to Eddie. He expects to be obeyed. I think that's right. And Gene says he doesn't seem to care about any sanction of the victim. That's an interesting question that maybe we'll be in a better position to think about whether that's true as we see more of him in subsequent chapters, but he's at least not dressing up in some moralistic language what he's doing. I mean, in some sense, what he's supposed to be doing is providing for the public welfare, and I guess he claims he's doing that, but he doesn't, as David put it, feel the need to talk about the specific way in which this is in the public welfare. He just takes it as he's authorized to say what he wants. And David actually on the forum drew, I thought, a nice parallel to some stuff in contemporary politics. But so what about their attitudes towards Dagny? I'd asked a little bit about that. David online said that Cuffy Migg's attitude towards her was dismissive. He treats her as a technician who will press the right button to get the results that Miggs demands. And he puts a little quote from Miggs, which is one of the quotes I had in mind when we thought of this question. She's the little girl who's such a wizard at railroading. And that's a wizard at railroading. It's like he regards her as I don't know. It's like he doesn't see her as a person. He's not concerned with how she thinks. He's not concerned at all with what makes it possible. But she just sees her as something we could use her to fix the railroad, I guess. Amber has some things to add on this, right? That he doesn't seem to believe that Dagny could exist. And Amber, in something I totally agree with, draws a parallel to some characters in The Fountainhead, that Miggs is Gus Webb to some of the other looters, Ellsworth Toohey. I think that's right, but let's not explore that further for people who haven't read that novel. Ben, I thought what Gene said was interesting. Do you have any thoughts on that? So Gene was saying that, pointing out that when Dagny returns the first time, Mouch and Weatherby are trying to kind of propitiate her and ingratiate themselves to her. And as you point out, Ben, Go ahead.
This is actually where I got the point that I was making before, forgetting that I had gotten it from Gene. Thank you, Gene.
Okay. But you were saying before that Weatherby has this kind of propitiating tone from the beginning, or this, not propitiating, but covert, I'm just here to help tone from the beginning, even when what he's really doing is effectively issuing orders. But Gene was also talking about how once Dagny comes back, Mouch calls her up and wants to know that he's willing to help in anything she needs, and I think he really is, or at least Dagny thinks he really is, caving to her in a way. And Mouch doesn't do anything like that, doesn't even make a pretense of being flexible and accommodating. And so in light of all of these things, Miggs sees focusing on the long term as impractical. He's practical because he's just focused on the short term in a way that's like all the other looters, but it's much more short term, right? He's much less, he doesn't himself seem to be taken in by or feel a personal attachment to or believe at all in the public welfare language, which the other looters use as a pretense. Now, that's true of Fred Kinnan also, but Fred Kinnan is a much more long-range thinker than the other looters. At least he's the one who has clearly in his head at that meeting where this is all headed, when the other ones don't, right? Which is why there's something more appealing about Fred Kinnan than the other people at that meeting, at least to a lot of readers, and I think in a way there is. Mouch, though, does, or rather Miggs, though, doesn't, right? He's more short-range than any of the other thinkers, and he's the voice of this super short-range program. And Amber raises the question that, Ben, I thought it might be interesting for you and I to spend a moment on, is Miggs a pragmatist? And I've been trying to avoid, in the past, philosophical jargon of, or references to philosophical schools that are outside of the novel, because it's possible to get sort of too much in the weeds of, well, is this like Kant or not, and what exactly did Kant think, and what about Descartes? But this language, I think, is useful to spend a moment on. Do you have any thoughts on pragmatism? Should we understand him as a pragmatist? Which of these characters would you think of as more pragmatic?
My initial response to that is to think that he's not anything, that he's not anything that's reflective of a philosophical attitude, at least. I mean, you might call him a pragmatist in the sense that every gangster is a pragmatist, that they're concerned with doing whatever works in the moment. But I doubt that in the case of someone like Cuffy Meggs, that this is some kind of self-conscious philosophy on his part. If anything, the stress here is that he doesn't have any self-conscious philosophy. And that's, in contrast with other characters, other looters in the book who do have it, like James, for example. I mean, James is, I think, more plausible as a candidate for someone who's something like or in the neighborhood of a philosophical pragmatist. He doesn't, he wants to compromise one principle with another. He wants to do it for what works. He wants to do it for, the public interest, which.
Ben's. Now you're back, Ben. You were frozen for. Ben.
Sorry.
It's not. You didn't freeze yourself, but you were saying.
I don't know what the last thing you heard me say was, but I was talking about James and how he was more plausible as someone with a philosophical perspective like pragmatism, but not so much for Meggs.
This is something that comes up a lot in Rand's nonfiction. So, just with regard to her own writing on people like presidents and so forth, right? So she regarded the Kennedy administration, which was, of course, after the time of the publication of this novel, as pragmatists. And she thought of what they were doing she called it an anti-ideology, right? A bunch of ideas which are meant to drown out or destroy in your mind the kind of abstract connections, principles that you need to think about large-scale issues. And she thought the Kennedy administration was using ideas to undermine, using kind of complex rationalizations to undermine the ideas of individualism, collectivism, of statism, and of fascism and statism on the one hand and capitalism on the other, and obscure all the important issues that were behind the political issues of the day, so that we would not think in terms of freedom versus statism anymore, but in terms of piddling little distinctions like, how much money should be invested in healthcare for the elderly or something like that. And of course, that led to the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, and then ultimately in Johnson to Medicare. But the Nixon administration wasn't ideological in that way, she thought. And she thought none of the subsequent administrations were ideological. And so if we mean by pragmatism a kind of ideological view that says that absolute principles and such like this aren't significant in the way you might have thought they were, and you should give them up because they're constricting and be more flexible in your way of thinking. That's what she thought the Kennedy administration was doing, and the kind of characters who might be like that in this novel would be like Simon Pritchett And to a certain extent, although at a lower grade, Floyd Ferris says that kind of thing, right? He's someone who is an intellectual by profession and who says the kind of things that would be published in books about this that are aimed at destroying a principled view of existence. Then you have characters, and I think Rand would have put Nixon and I think most of the subsequent presidents in this category, who aren't sort of on an ideological campaign like that, but who are the results of the at least partial success of an ideological campaign like that. They're people who don't think in principle, but who aren't engaged in an articulate attack on principled thinking as such. And I think this is, in some context, she would call Nixon a pragmatist, and I think in those same kind of contexts, she would think of a character like Mr. Thompson as a pragmatist. But Meggs is something different. Meggs is someone who's totally thoughtless, totally short range, like a brute. It's not that he's just kind of working to undo principles, but has some sense of them. He doesn't even have the kind of guilt or a kind of feeling about them that a Jim Taggart has. He's just like a low-grade, he has the revolting handsomeness of a barroom corner. He's like a run-of-the-mill neighborhood tough. And so I agree, I wouldn't call him anything ideologically in that sense. And I think part of the message of the story, and this is why the think of him as an heir to some of the earlier characters, I think is right, is that when you're on the kind of premises and on the kind of trajectory that this society is, you start out with these erudite people with some woozy ideas that do violence to the idea of leading your life by ideas. And then that leads you to these kind of schmoozy sophisticates who are unprincipled and unscrupulous, people like Orrin Boyle, and another way people like Mr. Thompson. But the end of this road is just undisguised gangsters. And I think you use the word gangster, which I think the right word to use for this kind of person.
And in that respect, it's probably significant, right, that the intellectual types, or those of them who are left in this country, are the ones who are portrayed as kind of being under the gun of Thompson and Meggs and others like him in this first scene.
Yeah, and we should
Stadler, for that matter.
Yeah, and we should expect the balance of power to be shifting in the direction of the Meggses from the direction of the Mouches and the Thompsons.
And we should expect it if we're to believe what Francisco told us earlier in the money speech, something that we wanted to connect this back to, right? Because he says that, if you have two ways of dealing with men, you've got dollars or guns, and when the dollar loses its power, when people no longer seek to offer values and instead only seek to offer threats and force, then I don't remember the passage. The battle goes not to the, what is, you know it better than I do, I bet.
Well, not it's to the most vicious in some way, or the most unscrupulous, right? So that the murderer wins over the pickpocket, and there might be a few other people in the chain. I don't have the exact quote. Okay, so any further thoughts from the table here about Meggs and what his advent represents? And then I'd like us to move on to Dagny's observation of the people in the world. But any things Ben and I haven't hit yet on Meggs, or on the Facebook live chat? Ben, I can't see that chat right now, by the way. So if you can, let me know if anyone there has anything to add on this. Any Meggs
Corey
thoughts?
says he just wants to hear you explain the book more.
He wants to hear me what? Explain it more?
I think it was a compliment.
Oh, well, thank you, Corey. Thanks, Corey. You want to hear "well done" said, says Dagny and Daniger and such. Okay, so Will on Daniger, on Mount, or on
Well, you
Meggs.
can call me Will. That's
Sorry,
fine.
I'm
When
now
in
always
here-
calling you Will.
Yeah,
Sorry,
you are.
Earl.
You are. Well, I'm one of your Wills. I guess you could say, to coin a phrase, that he hits a kind of a bedrock. He shows no respect and no deference. Simply walks out, honor, nothing like that. So it can't get he's short of rude, but it's even ruder to do nothing, and that's him. I mean, you can't get more than that. It's a way. Now that Will one might want to pop in on that.
Yeah, well, what I think of is nitwits online keep asking pseudo questions like, is Trump the Ayn Rand hero? And I say if he resembles any Rand character, it's Cuppy Meggs.
Yeah, that's, I mean, if we want to go into contemporary politics, I don't want to go too far into it, but my thought early on was that there's a way in which that's the character he's most like, early on in the electoral process. Now, I think there's a significant difference, and I mean, Trump is not the kind of guy to walk around with a gun in his holster and a military tunic. He's not a proto-dictator in that way. No, but I mean, he doesn't have the personal trappings and style of that kind of a person. And yeah, I mean, Ankar Agate compared them in an article a few weeks back or months back. And I think insofar as there's a comparison between Trump and, or those of us who think there is, between Meggs and Trump, it would be along this line of we've had a progression where we've had figures who at one point were principled even if they had the wrong principles. Then you get figures who are sort of unprincipled and unscrupulous and kind of corrupt and schemers of the sort that you might think Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton were, and I do think they were like that. And now you have Trump, who is sort of more nakedly unprincipled than they would pay lip service to principles in a way where he'll just say, oh, we want to win or we want to be rich, but not about anything about what that means or what it is. What I find striking about Trump as a political phenomenon that makes me see a connection here is that there's a noticeable lack of even moral language or pretense to moral language in his talking. And if that's true, that whatever you think of the Bushes or of the Clintons or of the Obamas, they would at least, whether this is for the better or worse, make a show of talking about right and wrong and being good and bad and being a moral exemplar as a nation and so forth. That's, I think, absent in Trump. But people can do that. That doesn't mean, by the way, that he's worse, because it's not clear that I don't think Cuffy Meggs is the most immoral character in this book by a long shot. I think Jim and Lillian are both far worse. But I do think there's a point about what kind of person comes to power in a country that's on a certain course. And I think the rise of Trump as a political phenomenon is an example of the kind of direction that that she's talking about. Ben, any further thoughts, or shall we move on to observations of people?
That was an admirably even-keeled commentary on what is likely to cause controversy in other quarters. So,
I don't know that it's even-keeled. I'm sure the people who think I'm too anti-Trump or not anti enough, the leftists will think we are, a wing of the DNC here or something. But I want to move on. So let's move on to Dagny's observations about people, and we can start with her observations about people immediately when she comes back. And then I think we had some good comments on this.
Yes. So we asked what new observations she has about people in the outside world, and what questions these observations raise. Schuyler, in the earlier discussion, said people now seem to accept being hopeless and forlorn as a given. I guess he's saying, in previous parts of the book, they might have been hopeless and forlorn at times, but didn't accept it as unchallengeable. Pooja notes, I think, an important point that even Eddie seems to be feeling this way. And that's significant because Eddie is not just an ordinary person in the outside world. He's got principles, unlike many of the rest of them. Even James seems to be going to pieces. He has always been playing at being such a smooth operator in his pragmatist way, but his system is breaking down, and he's getting looked down at, with contempt by Meggs. Tarsha said that it looks like people seem to have changed, presumably for the worse, in the time since Dagny's been to the Valley, and this raises the question of, at least it should raise the question for someone like Dagny, whether does this mean that it's too late to save the world? Are the strikers right? Do these people really want to live? And I'll just add my own 2 cents to this mix, and that's that I think it's interesting that when we get this scene with Dagny and she's talking about, we're being given her observations of people, she sees the way they are as unreal. It's not just that they're being irrational or senseless and that she doesn't like the way they're being. She doesn't see them as real. And then there's an interesting contrast with this in the chapter. Once she gets back to the Taggart terminal, she looks at the statue of Nat Taggart and she says, it was real. However, she also pictures it with these sort of coils of mist, ghost-like apparitions surrounding it, as if, yeah, it's real, but it's about to disappear out of this world, which is unreal. And that's got to symbolize something in her mind and the significance of these observations that she's making, especially in light of the task that she's given herself and the premises that she's been asked to check.
One of the things I found particularly striking about her observations of people is, one side of it is how much unhappiness there is, how resigned people are to it, and her perspective on the reality of that. Another is there's a lot of focus on the mental functioning of people. So she's on the airplane, people are listening to this broadcast. It's the Project X broadcast that we see at the beginning of the chapter. We're not told who's speaking at the moment on the broadcast, because there were a lot of different speakers over the course of that period. But it doesn't matter, because they're all saying the same drivel, right? And Dagny thinks of it as fraudulent, this is a quote, fraudulent voices talking about some sort of new invention that was to bring some undefined benefits to some undefined public's welfare. The words were obviously chosen to convey no specific meaning whatever. Okay, so we have speakers who are BSing and are trying not to really be clear about what they're saying and just trying to create an emotional effect. That's nothing really new. But what is really striking is what she notices about the audience. So, quote, she wondered how one could pretend that one was hearing a speech. Yet that was what the passengers were doing. They were going through the performance of a child who, not yet able to read, holds open a book and spells out anything he wishes to spell, pretending that it is contained in the incomprehensible black lines. But the child, she thought, knows that he is playing a game. These people pretend to themselves that they are not pretending. So that's really significant. These people are engaged in a pretense to themselves, a pretense that they're understanding a speech, and the pretense that that's not what they're doing, that they really are understanding a speech and not playing at it. And then, more strikingly, so they are pretending to themselves that they are not pretending. They know no other state of existence. So this isn't these people are doing this now once in a while, but these people who are just average people on the plane, they're not, Jim Taggart or Cuffy Meggs. They're the, who you find if you happen to be en route back from Nebraska to New York. They know no other state of existence. So all they're doing their whole life is engaging into some kind of pretense to themselves that they're not living on some kind of pretense. So this is a very damning verdict about people, or a damning thing to think about people, that she's now thinking about them for the very first time. That they're somehow, their whole life is a kind of weird make-believe where they're making believe that they're not making believe. And everything, this is just how they are in general. That is a new thing I don't think Dagny's thought before. And it certainly bears on the issue of, well, who are they? What are they? Do they want to live? What do they want? What are these people looking for out of life? And then we see this again in her thinking about the looters themselves. I don't think of these people as the looters insofar as they're not the decision makers in society, but now in Dagny's reflections on Jim, on Meggs, on Mouch, on Weatherby. And Ben, do you want to talk about any of these passages, or do you want me to just?
Well, okay, so there's the passage that we were going to discuss from page 842, where she's putting her finger on the inconceivable manner of consciousness that they all knew she could tell them. It was useless to prove to them the irrational horror of their course and of its consequences, both Meggs and Taggart. And the secret of their consciousness was the means by which they escaped the finality of their knowledge. Now, this reminds me, first of all, of something that came up in the beginning of the chapter. The crowd in the stands, who are the intellectual leaders of the country, that Stadler thinks that they are the ones that this destructive device is pointing at, and he thinks that they know that, but they don't want to know that they know it. And then I think that the next passage that we were going to talk about connects to that even further. And this is from 846, where this is where she's finding out about the terms of she's found out about the terms of the railroad unification plan, and now there's this office of a morale conditioner, and they're trying to get her to go on the radio. And she says that the looting crew needed her sanction, and not to reassure their victims, but to reassure themselves. And through the allegedly crafty, the allegedly practical idea of deluding their victims was the only identification they gave to their own motive and their hysterical insistence. So I was asking earlier, why is it that that Ferris and the government want Stadler's sanction? And in fact, they put it to themselves in terms of, we need to delude our victims. We need to delude the public. They're losing confidence in our legitimacy. But could this also be true that they are trying to reassure themselves? It certainly seems like the crowd in the stands needs to be reassured. They're the ones who are who are about to panic, and they know that this is aimed at them, but they don't want to know it, and they're looking for words that will help them escape the finality of their knowledge, and they're looking to Stadler to give them those words. And by the way, we've seen this before in the novel. We've seen as recently as part 3, chapter 1, where Galt gave kind of his mini speech in, I think, Mulligan's house, where he says that part of the characteristic of the world outside that they're on strike against is this sort of irrationality whereby people try to get away with contradictions, and when they try to do that, somebody else has to support that. Somebody has to bear the burden of their contradictions. And here it looks like Dagny is being asked in particular to help them get away with their contradiction by reassuring them that everything's okay, that even though they know plainly that it's not, and the crowd in the stands needs Stadler to reassure them that everything is okay, even though they know that it's not. And before that, also, Rearden had said something similar to Dagny about what Dagny was giving to Stadler, which raises the question of why really does Stadler accept the invitation to come to this speech? I mean, one of the first things that we hear about him at the beginning of the chapter is that the reason that he came is the darkest secret that he doesn't want to acknowledge himself. So just like the crowd needs to be reassured that something destructive isn't happening to it, it seems like Stadler needs just the same kind of reassurance. And he's getting it from the crowd. I mean, he's getting it from the fact that these people are applauding him from time to time. But more than that, he's getting it from the very act that he's engaging in. He's giving himself some kind of rationalization by doing this speech and reassuring himself, no, he's not actually under the gun. He hasn't been given army orders to come. Really, he's Robert Stadler. And keep in mind that the machine is targeting him too, and he actually built it. And more than the crowd, he needs the reassurance that he's not the one who's been trying to destroy himself. And I mean, what is he doing when he's tearing up the press pass for this journalist, this young idealistic person who reminds him of one of his favorite students who had a mind that could change the world,
and who has to be dead. Right. So when he said that man has to be dead, when he said to Dagny, I knew someone named John Galtman, and he didn't permit himself then to know the full meaning of his words, that he needs him to be dead. Right. He needs him not to have seen the book, What Makes You Think You Think, and certainly not to see this. And you can think of it as a kind of positive reassurance he's getting. I think it's hard to see that happening with Stadler. Like, he doesn't believe the speech, but it's a reassurance in a different sense of he needs to have something take away or mute or hide the realization of what's happening to him or what he's done. He needs to get away from that knowledge or escape the finality of it, as it says. Yeah.
And Greg, Pooja in the chat is saying morale conditioner, LOL. It just occurs to me now that, I mean, what is going on throughout this chapter, but various kinds of morale conditioning. The crowd needs its morale conditioned. Stadler needs his morale conditioned. James needs his morale conditioned. All these people need it conditioned by somebody else who's going to give them some kind of sanction to do that. And of course, we'll get to see what happens when they ask for it from Dagny. Shortly.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the case of Stadler, though, I mean, Ferris isn't trying to puff Stadler up anymore, right? Or trying to pretend to Stadler that he's really Stadler's servant, right? At this point, Ferris has Stadler whipped and wants him to know it. So it's a little bit different.
I mean, I didn't mean to suggest that morale conditioning meant giving them positive self-esteem. I mean, the office of the morale conditioner itself is a euphemism, right? What it really means is it itself is a rationalization for what they're really trying to do, which is something like the fear alleviators, for the sake of allowing the regime and the leaders of the regime to live with themselves for the time
Even
being.
There, right? Because Ferris is for the first time using open threats against Stadler, which he hadn't ever done before. And he's delighting in doing it. So I think Ferris isn't trying to help Stadler evade the situation anymore. Rather, Ferris's victory over Stadler is complete here, and now he's telling him, now you're my pawn. So I think, which is a different thing than what's going on in some of these other cases where they are trying to help alleviate their fears or put them down. And indeed, part of the reason why Ferris is trying to scare Stadler, I mean, he literally threatens him now for the first time, you'll be expelled and be starving and so forth, is, Stadler could actually stop this, right? Stadler could do what Dagny does when she goes on the radio. That's what the young, slightly John Galt-like press boy is asking him to do. And he's intimidated out of doing it. And part of the intimidation is what will happen to him. But I think another part of it is he'd have to admit his complicity in this. And so now he either has to, in effect, say, I was wrong and I've enabled this and I was wrong up until a few minutes ago, right? Or he has to go the rest of the way with the side he's chosen to be on. Let me turn back to Dagny, though. Go ahead, Ben.
Just real quick, Meryl in the chats points to one of the themes of the speeches that are being given. Lack of faith. Lack of faith is the only thing we've got to fear. There's several other speakers who are saying things that are similar, and I mean, this is what James and Stadler and many of the other leaders all have in common, is that they're seeking solace in their faith. They're just believing that they aren't responsible for the situation that they've brought themselves to, even though they are.
A situation beyond our control, circumstances beyond our control. But let me go back to this to the particular thoughts Dagny was having. So we've said a lot of really interesting things about what's going on in the looters' minds and how Stadler is a part of that, and like and unlike some of the other looters. But and so I'm really glad all this has come out. But let's return the focus now not just to the fact of how the looters are, but to Dagny's processing of it, because if we're interested in her checking her premise that they want to live, right? Not only is what we want to learn out of looking at these chapters, what are these people actually like, but what's the development in Dagny's understanding of what they're like. And so if we go back to those same two passages that Ben talked about, we can pull a couple of more things out of them additionally when we focus on Dagny's perspective on it, right? So in some inconceivable manner of consciousness, they, Meigs and Taggart, knew everything Dagny could tell them about why this plan won't work. So they know that this won't work in a manner that's inconceivable, that is inconceivable to her. She gets there's some way in which they do know what I'm going to tell them, but I can't get it. It's an inconceivable, mysterious way. And then the secret of their consciousness was the means by which they escaped the finality of their knowledge. So she's grasped there's some weird, incomprehensible way in which they hold this knowledge. The secret, the thing I don't understand about it, is how they escape the finality of the knowledge, how they're able to act in a way that's incompatible with what they know to be true. They know they can't get away with it, and yet they act as if they could. If they know that this won't work, they should therefore act as though it won't work, and yet they don't. They act as though it could work. There's something unknown to Dagny that enables them to do that. And it's not some it's not some scheme or something. It's the secret of their consciousness. So there's something about the way their minds function, which she doesn't understand, that enables that. And they're needing extorted reassurances from her is somehow part and parcel of that, I think. But notice
Greg.
Some inconceivable manner, so she's noticing something she doesn't understand, and then she's specifying a little bit about it, but it's still a secret. She still doesn't get it. Yeah, Ben.
I was just going to add, let's also remember the reason that she's decided to go back to the world from the valley, because she cannot believe that men can refuse to see, that they can remain blind and deaf to us forever, when the truth is ours and their lives depend on accepting it. They still love their lives, and that is the uncorrupted remnant of their minds, so long as men desire to live.
Yeah, very good point. So, Ben, I've just lost your audio for a second. I think it'll come back. It's a connection issue. But I was stressing about Dagny's reason for leaving the valley, this idea that everyone out there still loves their lives. But it's not just that taken in isolation, they love their lives. That somehow Axton sees as the most fundamental one, because that's the one that he asks, do they? Do they really love them? But for Dagny, this issue is connected to, because they love their lives, and because certain things are obviously true, people can't remain blind to them forever. They're going to have to see them. They love their lives, don't they? If they love their lives and their lives depend on their grasping this, they're going to have to grasp this at some point, especially when all the evidence is overwhelmingly for it. But now what she's noticing is that somehow some of these people have a means of escaping the finality of their knowledge, some inconceivable secret to her means of not knowing the things that they know, of not seeing the things that they've got to be able to see. What many of them are doing are somehow pretending to themselves that their state of consciousness is very different than it is, and this is a pretense that they are constantly in. They know no other state than this pretense. So the idea of vision, or what they can see or not, is very related. It is the kind of thing that she's noticing, more than this kind of motivational thing at this point of whether they love their lives or not. Although we know, in her view, those two things are connected. And we'll have to track, as she learns more about this, how she comes to understand the connection in these people. Ben, your signal's good again now, so if there's anything more you wanted to say on that.
You're welcome, Maria. And Alex in the chat says they're dealing with cognitive dissonance, not being able to examine their premises or to fix their contradictions. I mean, yeah, I mean, people never believe contradictions outright. They never believe A and non-A. So what they have to do is they have to figure out a way to keep both of them out of their mind at the same time. And there's all kinds of different rationalizations that they can use to do that. But this is the inconceivable manner of dealing with their consciousness that that Dagny's now looking at, and it's probably being brought into relief for her by the fact that she's just been in this world where consciousness is taken so seriously, where, Galt was all about accepting the facts and being conscious and seeing, and his best loved faculty is sight and so forth.
Yeah, by the way, cognitive dissonance, which, who was it that just used on the chat? That's pragmatist jargon. That term comes from, I think, Dewey. But in any case, it's a piece of pragmatist terminology. And the way the pragmatists think about it, this is the real philosophical pragmatists, that is people like William James and John Dewey, that, philosophers who call themselves pragmatists, is that, most of the time you go through life in a kind of fog, not really thinking. Then you experience cognitive dissonance, two things clash, and now you've got a problem that you have to solve, and so you think until you can resolve the clash, and then you can go on in thoughtless stupor again. That's only a slightly cartoony version of what they say. I mean, Dewey says thinking is a dis-ease, dis-ease. It's something that happens when you're made uneasy, and then you go back to not thinking. So I do think there is something pragmatist-like, or like what the pragmatists describe about the way these characters function, and it's something that Rand and Dagny and Galt think is not a good way to function. But Dagny doesn't understand what the way they function is. You're not supposed to be able to, or anyway, there's something she doesn't understand about how they function. We'll have to follow up on what that is. But I just wanted to comment on that bit of pragmatist terminology, both not to own it and use it in our own voice, although it's not a horrible bit of terminology if you understand it differently than the pragmatists do. But it's, I think, significant given our topic that it comes from that theory. All right, let's move on and briefly discuss the theme with Lillian's blackmail, and then I want to move on to the last scene with Rearden and Dagny. It's been most of our remaining time on that. We had some discussion on the groups about the motives of people in trying to get Dagny to go on the air, and we've discussed most of that already. The one thing that, in connection with what the looters are after and their motive, the one thing that I think it is worth pausing over is Lillian's motive in particular, right? So Lillian's not somebody who's in political authority. Granted, as she puts it, her sympathies have always been with the political party now in power, but she has a real personal reason for wanting to force Dagny into this. And does anyone, either here or on the chat, have anything they want to say about Lillian's motivation or what we learn about Lillian in this scene? I mean, what drives Lillian has been something we've always been a bit interested in, right? But I don't know if anyone on the chat is saying anything about that.
Not yet about Lillian. I've got some discussion comments.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, your connections.
Well, Greg P. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
That on one level, it looks like what both James and Lillian are doing is trying to please higher officials by trying to manipulate Dagny onto the radio. But at a deeper level, it seems like they just want to drag Dagny down. They both got reason to resent her superior ability, and they resent this fact. Now, Pooja also, I think, dug a little deeper onto this point, because it's not just, so in the case of Dagny and James, we have a better idea of what the basis for the resentment is. Dagny is the one who's really been running the railroad all along, and James knows it. What's motivating Lillian? Why does she care so much about manipulating Dagny? And, of course, in doing so, she's also somewhat contributing to manipulation of Rearden, but it's more directly against Dagny. And in earlier scenes, Pooja points out, we've seen how Lillian seems to be obsessed about not just controlling people, but controlling the controllers. And we saw this when she got a lunch with James, and that was the special tiara, just that she was able to get him to come. And there's something similar going on here. Pooja suggests that Dagny seems to be someone who's in a a position of control, by virtue of the fact that she's, the way that Lillian sees it, Dagny's been able to put something over on Rearden. After all, she was able to sleep with Rearden and get Rearden basically to sacrifice his medal for the sake of her. And I think that's why it's important that when they're speaking, basically Lillian says, "Since you like bluntness, don't you, Miss Taggart? Since your chosen status is that of a whore, I take my hat off to you in regard to the price you exacted, which none of your sisters could ever have hoped to match." And well, but she's going to do her one better, because now she's going to be able to control Dagny and out-whore the whore, in effect.
I mean, I don't see her as thinking that Dagny's controlling Rearden, although, she does think that Dagny would be pleased by how much he was willing to give up for her, but she didn't think Dagny intended that, right? But it is in line with what you're saying and what people on the chat are saying. Lillian is someone, and we can see it in this scene, who is driven by her knowledge of her own ineffectuality, right? So she says, "You're able to make money and I'm not, and you always have the luxury of acting on your own will, and my husband does too, but I don't." So Lillian has this sense that there are people who are able to get ahead in the world and to do things and achieve things, and I, poor Lillian, aren't. And in compensation, I'm going to get those people to act on my will, on occasion at least. And that's what she says to Dagny, right? In compensation, I'm going to see you act on my will for once. You're always able to do whatever you want. I'm not able to afford that luxury. But now I can get back at you and at the world, and whatever it is that makes it the case that I can't do whatever I want and you can, by getting you to do what I want. And I think that's kind of the key to Lillian. And we'll see more on that later. Earl, did you want to add something on that?
Well, I just wanted to, I think you're just stopping short of a word. I think that she seeks to injure. I think that's the point. Even more than control or something like that. She wants to hurt them both, and she does.
I think that's true. I think she does want to hurt them both. And I think Jim, as we'll see more and more, wants to hurt them both. But in Lillian in particular, in the way she at least describes what she wants, which is, I think, different from Jim, there's a particular emphasis on her wanting to control. And whether that's to control to hurt or to control as part of the same thing that would make her want to hurt is a good question. But at least her own self-description has a lot about controlling or wanting to control. And how controlling relates to hurting or destroying is something that it's worth thinking about more as we go on. All right, so let's move on to the last sequence. Of course, Dagny goes on the radio. Dagny explodes the whole scheme of blackmailing them by saying, as Galt would, right, like, "It happened and I'm proud of it." Taking the thing that was meant as an insult to her and owning it and making a boast of it. I think she would have done this even before having been in the Valley, but it is a Galt-like thing to do. Her one bit of trepidation about this, right, the one thing that makes her hesitate or unhappy that she has to do it, but she knows she has to do it, is that Galt will hear it. And she doesn't think Galt knows about the affair with Rearden yet. And she thinks if he does know she was carrying out an affair with Rearden, she would think, well, what gives? I mean, I was just with her in this valley, and we had all these moments and this closeness, but she was with someone else, and maybe she wasn't. He'll look at that time differently and think she wasn't free to have the kind of closeness with him that they both, the kind of connection to him that they both self-consciously had. But she does make the speech. I don't really want to spend time on the content of the speech, just because we're short of time in general. But let's go to the conversation that Dagny or the episode of Dagny returning home and Hank is there. And a few things are striking about this, right? We'd asked a question about about how Rearden's grown, because the first thing Dagny notices about him is that he's grown, not in the sense of aging as Eddie has, looking more and more worried, or Jim having gone to pieces, but in the proper sense, as a narrator puts it, of maturing, coming to understand better. Ben, do you want to share with us some of the highlights of what we got from the Facebook group on Rearden's growth?
Yeah, I think that Schuyler had a nice comment here that Rearden is perceived as shrugging off his guilt, and then, in Schuyler's words, he asserts himself through his words with an ease and grace and resonance. He understands who he is and why he does business and loves Dagny, has become more like Francisco in his moral musings about his work and his romantic relationships with Dagny. I think that packs a lot into one description, Schuyler. David also points out that Rearden has come to understand why it is he's been losing these battles in spite of his power. Basically, he's been giving his enemies power by subverting his own pride and accepting their doctrines about sex. And David also points out that Francisco has become more like Francisco in another. We find out, of course, that Rearden has figured out that Dagny has found somebody else that she actually loves, and yet he's serene about it in the same way that Francisco was when he realized that he might never be able to have Dagny again.
I think, sorry, I didn't put my mic on. I think those are all really good observations. It's worth tying them into the arc of this scene. And then we'll talk about each of these points. So Dagny comes in, she sees him there, she sees that he's seen the broadcast. Just looking at him, she sees this kind of growth or maturity, or somehow he's somewhere where he wasn't before. And what happens? She breaks down crying, right, and sobs at her feet. Now she's just been so strong on the radio, she's just come back from the valley. This is the first time, I think, in the novel we've seen Dagny openly cry. Right, she was crying in kind of covert ways, sometimes in her office. She was kind of silently sobbing, sort of, when she saw Rearden's plane up through the telescope, but she hasn't broken out in front of somebody just openly crying and letting them see it, I don't think. And I can't at least remember a previous instance of one. Do you remember one that I'm forgetting?
She even says it's never before in her life.
Never before in her life, I would say. Yeah, so this is the first time she's breaking down in front of Rearden. She's letting Rearden kind of reassure her and comfort her, because she sees in him, she's just been through so much, and she sees in him someone who could take it and understand it. And we get that this was what she had always seen Rearden to be, that he was, even though often she had seemed the stronger one, or the one who was ahead of things and understanding or whatever, he had this strength that she could call on if she needed it. And we've seen intimations of that before, because, for example, though Dagny did cry before at Rearden's strength once, although it's not explicitly said that that's what happened, you can tell that that's what happened, when Rearden calls her after the passing of the Equalization of Opportunity bill, and she's expecting him to be, she's all worried about him, right? And he's all excited, oh, forget about that, never mind, I got this great bridge idea, right? And he says, what is it, do you have a cold? And it's clear that what's happening is she's just cry or just moved, whether it's to tears or to some physiological kind of response like that, by this. So we've seen intimations of this before, but not now. She's where his strength was a kind of buttress for her in moments of despair, but now we have it. She's just crying at his feet, and he's somebody who could take it or assume the responsibility that is just bearing down so much on her, and who could understand. But she thinks, as she thought about Francisco in that moment when Francisco was, okay about her and Hank, when she first learned that she was alive. Oh, it's all right, we'll help Hank too, and he'll come here and it'll be okay. She thinks, oh, well, he's summoned all his strength to do this. There's yet another blow to come, right? To Francisco, the blow was, no, I'm really with Galt. To Hank, the blow would be, well, the same blow. She can't say it's Galt, but I'm not going to be with you anymore. And she thinks, now it's cruel of her to tell him this, and she's terrified that she wouldn't have the strength to tell him, but also terrified that she would have the strength to tell him because it's so horrible to hurt someone in this way, right? And she's crying in part over what she made him go through, and she made him fly around for a month looking for her corpse. I mean, this is really awful. And then, right, so she sees how strong he is, and then she's scared about what will happen when she tells him the truth. He makes this speech to her first in which he says he loves her, and does it and recounts all that he's learned in his perspective on what's happened over this time. Some of what he's learned were things he had already learned in the gift certificate scene and come to tell her, right, in the night when he found Francisco in her apartment, but because Francisco was there, that night took on a different character, so it wasn't going to be that he was going to choose to tell her that he loved her, or to choose to tell her that by accepting the mind-body dichotomy and their view of sex, he gave them power over his business and everything. So some of that he already knew, but he has a deeper perspective on it now when he's able to say more of it. He starts with that he loves her and then says the rest. And then he ends with, now I'll tell you what the thing that you wanted to tell me, I figured it out that you've met someone else. And then he accepts it with this Francisco-like perspective on it, showing, in effect, that he's even stronger or more together on these points than she was awed to see he was when she first walked in. So that's what I see as the kind of trajectory of the scene. One other point, two other points that I think are worth mentioning, and we'll take a few minutes to see if people here want to comment on it further before we wrap up, is about this. One is I'd like to take a second or two to talk about, and Earl, I know you had some thoughts on, how to understand his being so accepting and equanimical about that he's losing her. And two, a new idea that we see in Rearden's talk now that we haven't seen before from him, we've seen it only from Galt before, is this idea of faking reality. And so I think it's just worth noting, we've seen the Francisco-like nature of some of the new things that ways in which Rearden's grown. But we also have him now thinking in terms of this idea of faking reality that we heard before from Galt, and he now thinks he was faking reality by keeping their affair a secret, by hiding it as a shame, and he was still faking it when he signed the gift certificate. And that's interesting, and so we now see Rearden thinking he made an error when he signed the gift certificate, and what that error was. And I think we had wondered about that at the time. Why does he still do it? And that's something we can take a lot more thought on. What's his current perspective on the gift certificate episode? Let's do that on the Facebook forum if people want to. For now, Earl, did you want to share your thoughts on Rearden's acceptance of another man in her life?
Actually, I lost interest in that idea, but I've been, a few moments ago, I wanted to underscore what I thought was a very good point you made, and that was that Dagny has close to her the major enemy. And I was going off thinking about that's a universal and essential quality, whatever you want to call it, the worthy opponent or whatever. I remember Will a few years ago was reading some C.S. Lewis on the maledictory Psalms, but that's, each, as Dagny's lovers grew in virtue up to, the perfect John Galt, so her enemies need to grow and get stronger. So that's the point I've been thinking about, more than the Francisco restructuring himself.
And you're seeing the enemies as who here?
Well, it was Jim, you were talking about. I mean, they go so far as to share blood.
Yeah, I mean, in one way the enemy is Jim and has been all along. In another way, the enemy all along has been Galt, and each of her lovers have been adversaries. And what's really driving the conflict is something that we'll have to see what Dagny's perspective on it is ultimately, but Galt's perspective on it is that it's Stadler and her that are his ultimate enemies, which would mean that Stadler worse, her the next to worst. So in some sense that he would be hers. The one thing I do want to say about how the men in her life process her having moved on it's true, and I said this before, it's true with Rearden as it is with Francisco, that they're just coming off thinking she was dead. So they had lost her one way or the other, right? Now she's back in the world and back in their lives, although alas, not in quite the way they would have wanted. And one of the, not fully back in their lives the way they would have wanted. And one thing that really strikes me about Rearden's way of formulating it, even more than Francisco's, which I find very moving, is Rearden says, look, what he gets from you, right, what you share with him is not going to be taken from me. It doesn't make what I've had with you any less. It's something I've never had. And I can't feel bad about that. Why? Because I value what I had too much. And I think that perspective on it I find really deep and inspiring. There's something unique and significant about what you share with someone if you're in love with them, and what you get from them, the kind of response you get from them. And it's, on your part, a treason to that response if you bitch and moan about it not being some even higher response that might be possible. I think it's even deeper than a better to have loved than lost kind of perspective. I don't know, I've had experiences with, I don't think I've had an experience of breaking up with someone who I've loved in this way, but with other people, talking to them and trying to, I don't know, this is a perspective that's very hard to have, and I find it very admirable in Rearden. And his taking it on so quickly, I think, comes from the fact that he's thought she's dead, couldn't understand how she could have sort of been able to get in touch with him, but not all this time. He's been flying back, thinking about this, then he hears the radio speech. So I think he's primed to make this kind of a realization. Ben, we think we do this. Ben, any further thoughts on this?
I have a point I want to make about the faking reality concept, if that's okay.
Please.
So, first of all, I find Rearden's reasoning for this point to be fascinating. It's not just that he makes the kind of Galt-like point that he's been faking reality when he was hiding his affair with Dagny, and that he shouldn't have, but his explanation for how having done that has gotten him to this point. He says, people think that a liar gains a victory over his victim. What I've learned is that a lie is an act of self-abdication, because one surrenders one's reality to the person to whom one lies, making that person one's master, condemning oneself from then on to faking the sort of reality that person's view requires to be faked. So reality now becomes Rearden's enemy insofar as he has to continually work to hide this affair. And the more that he cares that other people find out about it, the more he becomes subject and pawn to what they care about, which is, exactly the kind of thing that Dagny was warning him about in that exchange with Mayor Bascom, if you remember. But I want to take this and also back to the beginning of the chapter, because Stadler and his audience are all now engaging in various forms of faking reality about who they are and how they got to where they are. And so they're also then putting themselves in hock to their enemies, though in this case is the fact that they aren't faking, or the idea that they aren't faking. They're trying to fake themselves so much into a corner, and it's just now they're kind of in chains to each other, and it's like they're all going to go down together because of it.
And to the most brutish and gangster-like among them. So the murderer is winning out over the pickpocket. And you see Ferris has up till now been the most thug-like character, right? He has the appearance of a gigolo and the soul of a thug. Meg's now has the revolting handsomeness of a barroom corner, which I guess is even lower class than a gigolo. I don't know, it depends. There are high class and low class gigolos, I guess. But is a just open thug who's, not even dressed like something other than a thug. He has a thuggy handsomeness. And it's these people who are becoming having more and more power over people. And you can see that that's what's happening as a result of this kind of faking. Dagny thinks about Jim at one point that he's someone, is that in this chapter? Or it might be the next chapter, so let me not quote that line. Just two other thoughts and then we'll end. We wanted to only go 90 minutes tonight, and we've just gone a little over that, but I think making up for the technical difficulties. One just thing I want to point out, I don't really want to say much about it, but it's something I love and want to point out. It's just the moments between Dagny and Rearden when he's realizing more about what happened to her. He, infers that the man she loves must be the destroyer. He realizes where she must have been. She says, "Could you give up Rearden Steele?" And he thinks for a moment and goes through in that moment what she went through over her month. He asks, "What's his name of the man you love?" Right? And she says, "Who is John Galt?" And he, immediately realizes there is a John Galt. Oh, he made the motor, right? She tells him. And just there's something about those moments, and we get some more of them in chapter 5 that I really love, of Dagny and Rearden together bonding over what they're realizing about, what he's realizing about the strike, and their continued perspective on it, I find very interesting. The other thing I thought we might close on is Ben, I know, has some, I think, very good thoughts about the title, and that's a natural place to end here. I'm seeing Ben's connection looks a little laggy, but let's see. Ben, are you hearing me well?
Can you hear me now? Yes.
Now the connection's improved. So, yeah. So why don't you take us out on your thoughts about the title?
I was just going to chime in before that there were several people in the earlier discussion in connection with what you just said who thought that this chapter was the most romantic chapter in the book. And I can see why they might say that, though I don't myself have a view. But real quick thoughts on the title. I mean, it's called Anti-Greed, and of course this comes right after the chapter that was called The Utopia of Greed. So they're obviously meant to be that are explicitly described as being anti-greed. Project X, the railroad unification plan, and Lillian's manipulation of Dagny. Project X is supposed to be a non-profit, non-profit public venture. The railroad unification plan is basically modeling the from each according to its ability to each according to its need policy. And Lillian says she's doing this for no private interest of her own. And so this is what anti-greed looks like in the world, and with all of the attendant anxiety and need for self-deception that we've been discussing. And especially the way I think you get a contrast with the previous chapter, because the end of the chapter is Rearden, who, in spite of the fact that he's now just discovered that he's lost his love, is still describes himself as being happy and free of guilt, because he's paid the price of truth and power of vision. And he says he loves Dagny for the same reason he loves. So there's again this connection.
Yeah. There's again this connection between greed and self-interest and spiritual values. The internet connection for Ben was spotty, so let me just repeat. I think it would have come out and will be on the recording, but let me just repeat in case it's not easy to hear the one or two of the observations, which is the chapter is titled Anti-Greed, and we are shown 3 measures or acts that are announced as in the name of anti-greed, or the opposite of greed. Project X is a non-commercial venture. Stadler stresses that, right? This is not something any greedy industrialist would have done, even before he knows what it is. But anything done by the State Science Institute, you can't doubt its goodness because it's done out of a non-greed motive, something that Ferris then throws back in his face shortly later. The railroad unification plan is, ungreedy, or might be seen as ungreedy. It's what doing things in the public interest, at least by the author's view, ultimately amounts to. And then Lillian is not acting out of greed. There's no way she could be bought off. It's not like she's being paid by the people in power to try to extort this out of Dagny, in which case Dagny could try to, buy her at a higher price. She's doing it out of purely altruistic, non-greedy motives. And that gives us a sense of what, at least in the author's view, a purely altruistic, non-greedy motive would be. And what is the thing that's in common, especially and most obviously, between Project X and Lillian? What Lillian's doing, the things that are most explicitly described as anti-greed, they're both acts of destruction. Trying to control others and trying to destroy others, and trying to control others through the threat of destroying them. And exactly how we put herd and destroy and control, what the hierarchy of those things are in their desire set is, we can kind of debate about the details of. The next chapter is anti-life. We as people have pointed out, haven't solved all the technical glitches, but I do think we've been better and better at rolling with them and getting the show to go on one way or another. And we have options. So we'll think about whether the new ways we tried to connect are better or worse than what we've done in the past. All right. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. We will be back next time to talk about anti-life. Until then, bye-bye.